A lot of you were surprised to learn that there are more than 5,000 airports designated for public use in the US. And so the next question you might ask is, why so many? How did they all get there? And by the way, do they all have runways? Find out more on Aviation Intrigue as we explore the world of airports. We are cleared for takeoff.
This is aviation, aviation intrigue.
Based on our viewer feedback, we learned that there's a lot of interest in learning more about airports. So we thought we will do 10 surprising facts about airports that most people are not really familiar with. So, Elaine, why don't we start at the high level? Start with the, let's say, 30,000 foot level.
Sure, we can start with the large airline hubs, which is what most people are going to be familiar with. These are the large terminal areas we've all been to catch a flight or when we're coming back from a flight. And these are the biggest, most technologically advanced facilities in the world when it comes to airports.
I assume you're talking about these big airports that we tend to transition through, like the Chicago O'Hare, that kind of airports where no matter where you're going, you got to go find a connection. Is that what you mean?
Yes, absolutely. So a lot of us have been through the Chicago O'Hares of the world, LAX, Newark, Atlanta. If you think about these as large airline hubs, these are going to be among the biggest.
Yeah, for sure. I've spent more than my fair share in these big airports throughout the world. There's clearly a lot in the US, like the O'Hares and the Dallas and Atlanta you mentioned, but also outside the US, Frankfurt, London Heathrow. There's so many airports that are pretty big. Honestly, I'm not sure I like being in them. They are huge. They're crowded, and most of the time you have to meander through the crowds, especially if you have a carry-on that you're trying to lug. So my experience with them is not the greatest. I assume that most people have the same feeling.
Absolutely. I think most of us are too busy running through the terminal trying to catch a flight or trying to figure out how many bags you can carry on and where the gate is to think about just how amazing these facilities are. And we're going to talk a little bit about what are the biggest facilities in the world when it comes to airline hubs. But everybody knows these because these are hubs. Most airlines operate on a hub and spoke system, and that is where you're going to make your connection and where you're going to pick a flight that goes to another airline hub to pick up a connection there. So it's something that we're all familiar with. And even though they can be awfully crowded and awfully busy, if you think about it, they are pretty amazing.
I think we're going to reveal the biggest airports with a little bit of a twist later on. But I'm just kind of curious. Just let's stick to the US right now. How many hubs are there? I think we talked about 4,000 or 5,000 odd airports in the previous episode. How many of them are what you would call as these airline hubs?
Yeah, you'd be surprised that the airline hubs that we're all so familiar with only cover a tiny percentage of that 5,000 plus public US airports that we talked about in an earlier episode. And you'd be surprised to learn that it's just a handful, maybe a couple dozen, maybe 30 of these are considered US airline hubs out of the 5,000 plus airports. So it's only just scratching the surface there.
That's surprising because those are the airports that we typically deal with no matter where we start. But the world just doesn't end with these big giant airports, right? I mean, there are a lot of medium airports, small airports, tiny airports. And I assume the rest of the 5,000 outside of these 30 all in that category.
Outside of the large airline hubs, which are just a handful, we will have what we call large to medium airports. A lot of these will still service airlines, but they may not be part of the hub and spoke system. And even if they do offer airline service, they're only going to have maybe a few flights a day. And besides airlines, these will accommodate charter flights, cargo operations, and so on down the line to the smallest aircraft.
So I think the biggest airlines that we know, the Uniteds and the American type, they all have this hub and spokes. But Southwest has always been, at least mostly been sort of point to point. Maybe they use medium type cities or smaller airports in big cities?
Yeah, Southwest is a great example because they're a really well-known airline. I think a lot of us have had experience with that, but they don't quite follow that hub and spoke system as you would find with a Delta or an American, a large airline like that. They go from city to city, and the airports they serve tend to be just a little bit smaller than the hub airports. Great example is Chicago Midway, which is not too far from O'Hare, but it's a little bit smaller and almost as busy with airline service, but that's dominated by Southwest Airlines. And a city pair that a Midway flight would take you to typically would be maybe like a Kansas City. And so the Southwest flights would just go straight there, pick up the next load, and move on to the next city, or in some cases, back to Midway.
Yeah, it's almost like they have their own hub and spokes, but not necessarily to these big airports. Like in Dallas, they have Dallas Love Field, not the Dallas Fort Worth. In Houston, they have Houston Hobby, not the Houston Intercontinental. Baltimore, Washington, instead of Washington Dulles. So they seem to have their own system.
Sure, and that's why I would call those medium large airline service airports, even though in the scheme of things, and this is still only covering just a tiny percentage of that 5,000, those airports will still have full-time airline service, but not to the extent as the largest hubs. Yeah, you will also be surprised to learn that there is airline service to some pretty small airports, and as long as the runway lengths can accommodate, say, a small regional airline commuter, you will find some of those in smaller towns at smaller airports, and a lot of these are actually more dominated by either charter service or private aircraft of all sizes. And so sometimes the airlines will go to out of the way places.
Well, they have to go where the people are, I suppose, and I assume there are very smart people figuring out what the routes are, and I know they're constantly rejiggering where they go to, what is profitable, what's not, whether to run big jets or small jets.
I'm sure that's a daily tally in terms of how many flights and how many passengers are actually being served on a given day. And I've been to airports where there's only maybe one airline flight a day, and that may be a small commuter taking 10 to 20 people to the big airline hub. For example, there are small commuter airlines that will service a smaller airport, and that is to get people to the next hub, to the Chicagos or to the Denvers of the world.
Yeah, I assume that the big airports can accommodate big aircraft, and the small airports perhaps they can. So to some extent, where people are, where the big aircrafts are, matches with where the big airports are.
Absolutely.
One other thing is, I don't think most people think about it, but there are a lot of military airports too, not civilian airports. And we don't hear about it because sometimes on purpose.
I'm sure there are a lot of military airports that we may never see, but again, just scratching the surface, there's a handful of military-only airports where no one else is allowed to fly into or visit, for that matter, and they are serving all branches of the military. They tend to have long runways, just as long or even longer than the ones serving the airline hubs, and some of these military airports are known as joint use. There are maybe a few dozen or so that are for the military, for military use, but also allow civilian traffic in. So you do get a combination of those. And again, that is still just a small handful of the U.S. airports that we see on the list.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but if it is a military only, the civilians flying our little planes are not allowed to land on those.
That's correct. They will be restricted to civilian use. In other words, you don't want to spot a runway down there that could be a military airport and decide, hey, I think I'll go there. There are means and ways of checking all that to make sure that you don't inadvertently land at a military only airport, but they are pretty easy to spot. A lot of them are located on a map, and it is clearly labeled a military field. So pilots do know that they should steer clear of them so that they don't get into trouble landing at an airport that does not allow civilian traffic. And there are also thousands and thousands of privately owned airports, and these are outside of the 5,000 that we mentioned. So thousands more where not just anybody's allowed to go fly in because they're privately operated, privately owned, and you are supposed to get permission if you wanted to land there. And these can range anywhere from long paved runways serving larger aircraft to tiny dirt strips that you may never spot because they're, say, used for agricultural uses, or out west there are ranches that have their own private strips so that they can use aircraft to go around and monitor the area.
Yeah, mind blown in terms of not only there are 5,000 public use airports, but there are probably thousands others which are private strips, special use airports that nobody even knows exist. So it's fascinating. We're going to get a lot more into this, Elaine.
Yeah, a lot more interesting facts to reveal, so stick with us. What do you think are the biggest airports in the world? Put your guesses in the comments and we will reveal those later on. So GoPal, we talked about the biggest airports and the sizes of airports just a little bit below that. And we promised to reveal our list of the biggest airports in the world.
Yeah, there is a little twist there, though. When you're talking about biggest, it turns out there are actually two definitions of biggest. So let me just go take a look at our source and tell what it reveals. First is that the top three that are listed are world's largest airports. They are the King Fahd International in Daman, Saudi Arabia, Denver International in Colorado, and Dallas Fort Worth in Texas. These are the largest. That means they occupy the most space. I don't think I thought about it that way. To me, big airport means busy. Therefore, let's look at that. If you now look at the busy airports, this is in terms of number of flights or number of passengers passing through, the three biggest in the world are Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta, Georgia. Not surprising. Most of us knew that. Second one is the Chengdu Shuangliu International in Chengdu, China. A lot of people in China and very busy places. It's a touristy place. And the third one is Dallas Fort Worth again. So that one is repeated as both a large airport and a busy airport. Are you surprised that there are two categories?
I'm not surprised about Dallas because Texas is a big state. I mean, they're just the biggest in everything. I was a little bit surprised about the airport in China, probably because a lot of us may not be familiar with that. And I would have thought more like a London Heathrow, but it is probably in the top 10 or 20, but not on the top three.
Yeah, for sure. And Chengdu is a touristy place. That's where pandas are. So people go to see the pandas.
Is pretty amazing, and I would not have guessed the complete list there. And with these 5 airports, we've still just scratched the surface of these thousands and thousands of airports. So let's take the U.S. GoPal, because that's what a lot of us are familiar with. How did we end up with 5,000 airports?
You know, I wonder about that all the time. I think you have to go back in history to understand this. The truth of the matter is some of these airports, especially the small ones, have existed for a very long time, and sometimes even with roots in World War I and World War II, because they were created for either direct military purposes or supporting the military operations, is because they needed places for the military to operate out of.
And I think that the onset of passenger airline service had a lot to do with that early in the 20th century, and that probably led to a lot of airports being built.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when there's a need, you need to build the infrastructure. We all lived through this in the COVID years when suddenly there was less demand, and then it comes right back again. It's always cycle.
Definitely, and the airports just don't easily go away, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the episode. But over the 20th century, about the time when the airplane in the United States was invented, we just started building airports. And as the need for military uses, passenger air travel grew, they just accumulated to the point where we have that many and many thousands more with the same trends that had happened with the advent of passenger flight and personal travel all around the world. And the ages of some of these airports is amazing. GoPal, I've got a bonus fact for you. Are you ready? I'm going to pull this up right now. Okay. The oldest public U.S. airport, College Park, Maryland, 1909. that's pretty early on. I mean, that was in the infancy of the advent of airplanes in the United States. So that is pretty cool to know that that airport is still there.
That's interesting because, to my knowledge, there was Dayton and there was North Carolina, and I couldn't have pegged Maryland to be in one of them.
Yeah, definitely. And just like all the other airports of its size, they are serving a lot of purposes today, and most of them are still around.
Yeah, the history is amazing. The history of aviation is amazing. History of airports is also amazing. I'm not a big historian for airports, but this is very fascinating. Now, unfortunately, aviation and airports is not without controversy either. For whatever reason, and we know some of these reasons, that people have problems with airports and they fight it and they want these airports to go away.
Occasionally, there are going to be local controversies with airports causing noise with aircraft flying overhead. I believe is the biggest reason, along with just the crowds created both in traffic in the air and on the ground. And so you do occasionally get local controversies, and the industry tends to deal with that by obviously trying to keep the airport open and thinking of workarounds, like can they alter the paths of the aircraft coming and going so that they cause less noise pollution? Can they create facilities that take car traffic a little bit off some of the roads near residential areas? And so there's always a dialogue that goes on when there is a local controversy, and occasionally you will get debates that go on for a long, long, long time, because it is not easy to close an airport down, just as it is not easy to build one in the first place. And so a lot of these can go on for quite a bit of time, and the industry does have its way of addressing it.
Few of these airports have closed down. One of them that I remember distinctly is the mixed field in Chicago. I remember that, and I think many people would, because if you ever played the Microsoft Flight Simulator game, the game which started this mixed field beautifully located in the coastline of Lake Michigan, and that airport hasn't existed in a few years.
Yes, that is probably the most famous airport closure in the U.S. Due to its high profile. It was an airport that was it's in Chicago, quite near the large O'Hare Airport. And I've talked to pilots who said they've landed there in years past. So it's kind of cool because it's right on the water. But I think due to land use debates over other better uses for this land other than an airport, it eventually did close down, and so that is one of the famous closures that occurred in the United States.
Yeah, I assume that there are political reasons, there is economic reason, there's pollution, noise pollution reason, there is other uses for the land. There's many reasons that I'm sure you can argue both pros and cons as to whether an airport should continue to exist or not.
Sure, and that can happen with much smaller airports and less well-known areas. And I think one of the things the industry does try to do is to talk about the airports in their context, that they are a multiple use facility and they're not just used to provide runways for jets to come and go, for example. They have a lot more purposes than that.
Yeah, speaking of that, we keep thinking about airlines and mass transit, but airports exist to serve private travel, personal travel, and a lot of other uses that people may not be thinking about. For example, for medical purposes, where you have to get from one to another and you cannot go through roadways, for example, firefighting, there's a lot of uses for airports that are, shall I say, not hidden, but they're not as well known as traveling through O'Hare for airline travel.
Sure, and that's why it's fun to point out all of the thousands of airports that fall below that tier of the few dozen larger airline airports, because there are so many out there and they have purposes outside of the airlines. They will serve, like you mentioned, not just personal travel, not just business travel, but public benefit uses, charitable flights, medical need flights. I participated myself in animal rescue flights where pilots can volunteer to take animals from place to place because traveling several days by car with a bunch of rescue animals is not always practical. There are large nationwide and regional organizations just dedicated to charitable flying, and so that is just one example. There are other uses such as law enforcement use for both fixed wing and helicopters, all kinds of aircraft, as well as flight training and a myriad of other uses.
I think the law enforcement and use in emergency, that's actually a very overlooked use for airports.
That is actually one of the most overlooked uses for an airport because of the large flat areas that airports are structured around. They serve as staging areas for when there are natural disasters. You don't need all that space all the time for aircraft, as well as for emergency use aircraft. We talked about medical need, meta flights, things like that. Those are very, very common use for airports of all sizes. And it's good to think about airports like that as like your local fire station with the fire hydrant down the street from your house. Those may not get used every day, but they're there for an emergency and they are maintained to serve you well in an emergency. And that's one purpose of airports that we don't often think about. They are there for a variety of emergencies, whether they use aircraft or whether they're just there to provide the space for a disaster, to put debris, to have people housed, all vehicles, all kinds of purposes that they can serve. And so it's important to keep them maintained, keep them clear, and keep them safe, and keep them secure because they may be needed in an emergency.
Yeah, I know for a fact that when there are fires, typically out west, they have to rely on these remote, small airports to get the firefighting equipment in and out, water in and out.
That's a great point with firefighting, and not just out west where they've got the largest aircraft and the most variety of aircraft because of the scale of those fires, but in the Midwest and some eastern states on a smaller scale, they do use local airports to house aircraft for fire spotting, firefighting. There are military helicopters that do help with firefighting because they're able to scoop water from a local lake and dump it over the fire, and sometimes they'll stage at a local airport. And so the area that you find on the tarmacs, on the runways and taxiways all get used in situations like that.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. I happen to be transiting in one of my little plane adventures in, I think, somewhere in the Kansas, Missouri area. I was sitting at the airport for a couple of hours waiting for something, and I saw this 2 or 3 airplanes. They're big airplanes. They're amphibious airplanes, so they could land on water and on runways, and they were practicing how to go to the nearest lake, pick up water with a little scoop on their floats, and then they'll go dump it over. I mean, this was a training mission, and I ended up having a good conversation with those pilots in training, and I learned a lot. I mean, I have so much appreciation because that's not a easy mission to do.
Yeah, it's pretty fun to see a firefighting operation going on, whether for real or for training, because it's amazing the variety of aircraft that they use and a specialized aircraft, something like that. And I believe there's a Canadian-made aircraft called a Scooper that is capable of exactly what you described. And to find these aircraft in operation and to watch them flying and doing what they're doing is just really amazing.
Yeah, I think we should do a show, maybe invite somebody who does these kind of emergency operations. That would be a lot of fun.
Definitely.
There is one other category of airports that we have not talked about in any of the previous episodes or this one. And interestingly, these are airports without runways.
There are landing places for airplanes without runways. So we'll reveal an interesting fact right there. If you stick with us for the next segment, we'll tell you a little bit more about that.
Can't wait.
Do you have a favorite airport? Or is there an airport that you never want to go back to? Tell us your best and worst in the comments.
Okay, so we talk about these airports without runways. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I'm sure it's a trick question. So are you thinking like helicopters, drone ports, those kind of things?
That's a good guess. You don't need runways for quadcopters, helicopters, and there are additions to airports that have landing spots for those aircraft. But remember, I said for airplanes. So it's kind of a trick question. The category we're talking about here is seaplanes, which are fixed wing airplanes but have floats that can land on water. And there's any number of public seaplane bases. Around 480 is the estimated count, and that's a lot. That's more than the military and airline hub numbers combined.
That is interesting. 480 seaplane bases in the country, just US, right? We're not talking global numbers. And okay, that was definitely a trick question because I was not thinking seaplanes because technically the seaplanes land in water and therefore there are not runways. But even though there are not runways, there's some designated places for them to land and take off. Is that correct?
Yes, if you look at the public use seaplane bases, they are charted on aviation maps just like regular airports are. But the cool thing about seaplanes is that anywhere it's suitable for space and a body of water that can accept a seaplane, they can pretty much land anywhere they want, which is an infinite number of landing sites for seaplanes. So I found that to be pretty cool.
I would love to get a seaplane rating. And for some of you wondering, when you get a private pilot license, that certifies you typically to go fly a plane that takes off and lands from a runway. In order to do a seaplane, you have to get additional training and additional testing before you can certify. So I'm not certified. Elaine, are you seaplane rated?
No, I'm not seaplane rated, and that's definitely on my list of future flight training because it sounds like a great fun challenge, and the freedom of being able to land on bodies of water anywhere you can go would just be an amazing way to fly.
100%. And we touched on this in our previous episode last week. And I'm telling you, one disadvantage of living in the upper Midwest is because we are frozen, half the year. Seaplanes, you don't have a lot of opportunity to land all the year. If I live in the South, for sure.
Definitely. That's one little limitation in the Midwest, but I don't mind it too much because I've landed on the ice in a fixed gear airplane, so you can have fun with that too.
So we talked about airports, big, medium, tiny, even airports without runways. However, a lot of people, especially non-pilots, when they go to airports, they look at this and that, and they have a lot of questions. They don't quite understand, what is this for? What do they do? So Elaine, what is the most, let's say, common question you get?
I would say by far the most common question I get when I'm showing someone who's new to an airport is, where's a control tower? And I'll say, well, this local airport does not have a control tower. And they're really surprised to hear that. There's a lot more airports than you think that do not have control towers.
What percentage, approximately speaking, have control towers versus the airports that do not?
So we talked about the 5,000 public use airports in the United States. Only about 10% of those, just a few hundred, actually have control towers.
Okay, that's certainly surprising, especially if you don't fly. For some of us who fly out of airports without control tower, that's way of life. But that is true. There are way more airports without a control tower than with. And then the question is, what happens? How do they control the flow of airplanes in this? And that's exactly why you go through training. There are protocols, radio operation. There are what we call as roadways in the sky that tells the planes how to travel even though they're not marked. It's like a map in the sky. So it's really fascinating. The other burning question that we get, Elaine, I'm sure you've heard this, is you're driving by the airport, typically at night and maybe some cloudy nights, and these flashing, somewhat annoying white lights that is like strobe lights. What are those for?
They're really common when you're maybe a mile or two from an airport and you may be driving along a highway and you'll see these white flashing strobe lights on the ground, really bright, flashing really fast. And I do get a lot of questions. Hey, what are those? I pass those while I'm driving on the highway. by an airport, and I'll say, well, a lot of airports have those if they have the equipment. They're commonly known as lead-in lights, and they are basically a row of lights that will point right to the end of the runway for aircraft coming in, and that helps, especially at night. Aircraft light up on the center line of that runway as they're coming in, and that's what those are for.
I've used them at night. You think you can see it, especially if it's cloudy or visibility is poor. You got to rely on these, what we commonly call as rabbit lights, and just kind of chase the rabbit to the runway.
Yeah, they're invaluable at night and in low visibility. And if you're traveling to an airport that's not familiar to you, that can really be helpful, and that can really be a big comfort to know that it's pointing right to the end of that runway. And then you can go from there, and the rest of the airport is lit up as well. There are runway lights, which tend to be white, unless you are at a big runway where you come to the end of that runway, and the colors of the lights will change to tell you that you're getting to the end. And if you're able to see an airport lit up at night and you see blue lights, those are taxiways. And those are meant to be very different from the runway lights, so that at night, when you're taxiing around, you can definitely tell one from the other. And some people have also occasionally noticed what we call the airport beacon. If you see a green and white flashing light, that is a civilian airport beacon. And that's just a symbol, the green and white, to tell you that there's an airport there. And that also makes it easier to find at night.
Yeah, and those are like looking at a lighthouse, and that's how you identify where the airports are. And I know I have relied on these quite extensively, especially landing at night or in poor visibility condition. The other question we get asked is, how do the pilots decide which runway to land? And the answer to that is perhaps surprisingly simple. It depends on the wind. Pilots like to land airplanes into the wind. So you want the wind to come directly at your nose if you can. If you cannot, you want it to come somewhat from your front. And wherever the wind is coming from, pilots line up the airplane in such a way that they are landing into the wind. This is also true with helicopters and other kind of aircraft.
That's right. It doesn't just apply to fixed wing airplanes. Helicopters also prefer to land into the wind whenever possible, and that keeps the speeds down when you're taking off and landing. It allows the aid of lift on the wings, whether you're a rotorcraft or a fixed wing aircraft, to better affect the flight of the aircraft. And pilots do try to avoid landing on what's known as a tailwind, when the wind is blowing behind you and on the tail, because it does speed you up unnecessarily and makes it a little harder to handle on the ground as well when you're landing.
I think that's very interesting, especially if you're not a pilot. When you're in the air, when you're trying to go from place to place, you want the tailwind pushing you really fast because you get to where you want faster. But when you're landing, you want exactly opposite. You don't want to go too fast. You kind of want things to slow down. So it's completely different when you're landing versus when you are flying in the air.
That's a great point. When you hear remarks about, oh, that was great that we had a tailwind, that's only going to be in en route flight and not when you're taking off or landing. So it's really great to tell people about that distinction, because I do get asked a lot, how did you pick that end of the runway versus the other end? Or why did you pick this runway when there's another runway right next to us? And so we do a little explanation about wanting to be in the wind as much as possible.
Of course, when you're flying into airports with the control tower will tell you which runway to land most of the time. So you're not choosing. But in those 90% of the cases where there's no control tower, we get to choose based on these winds.
Yes, and that brings me to another bonus piece of information that a lot of people do ask about. You mentioned when the control tower assigns the runway you're going to use for either takeoff or landing, you can disagree with them. You can say, well, I've got a wind shift here. Can I use the other runway? Or you can say, well, I prefer the other runway. Is that something that you're able to accommodate me, because I would like the shorter taxi, or I would like to take off more into the wind? And so a lot of people don't realize that you can discuss these things with air traffic control, that you don't always have to do exactly what they say if you see a safety of flight issue, or simply because there might be a preference for how little of a tailwind that you would like for your particular aircraft. And so it doesn't happen all the time, but once in a while you can have that discussion, especially when you do see a need for the aircraft you're operating.
Of course, if you're not in an emergency, the control tower may not grant you, especially in busy airspaces. The other question, Elaine, that we get asked is who pays for all this 5,000 odd airports and runways, maintenance, upkeep? Is this government funding? Why don't we share a little bit about that?
Sure, that's one of the questions that often come up. Hey, we've got all these great lights at this airport. We've got these really big, well-maintained runways. We've got all this equipment to help maintain the airport. And by the way, that's a lot of concrete to take care of, and in some places to plow in the winter. All takes people and equipment and management. And the common question is, yeah, who pays for all this stuff? So the nutshell answer is that a lot of the airport usage, which generally comes mostly from the sale of fuel, of aircraft fuel, goes to fund the airport infrastructure. And that is dispersed in a combination of mostly federal dollars and some chip in and some management at the state and local level. And so, in a nutshell, it's fuel and usage by aircraft operators that pay for most of the infrastructure required at an airport.
If you're watching, if you're listening, and you have more questions, or if you didn't understand something that we said or you want more explanation, let us know in the comments, because we would love to take more questions and talk about this in later episodes.
So we discovered that not only are there thousands of airports around the world, but there's an amazing variety from gigantic to tiny, accommodating all kinds of aircraft, from fixed wing to helicopters to drones, seaplanes, and all different sizes of runways and all different uses. And from the past, present, and future, we hope that you enjoyed learning about the variety that is out there. And hopefully we answered some of your burning questions about what's going on at the airport. Please post your questions. We'll use those for future episodes. And we've got a great lineup for you coming up. So stay tuned, subscribe, follow us, and join us next time on Aviation Intrigue. We are cleared to land.